So we've talked about vulnerability tools, assessment tools that we can use, which would be part of vulnerability scan. I even talked about vulnerability scanners. Now we're going to talk a little bit about pen testing. And before we do that, let's talk about the difference between vulnerability scanning and pen testing. So the two important assessment procedures we have are vulnerability scanning, which is rather routine and something I've talked about, but then also penetration testing is another technique we have available to us. You can take a whole class on both vulnerability scanning and penetration testing and ethical hacking, which is sort of the next level. So they're very similar and often confused with each other, vulnerability scanning and penetration testing, because the goal behind both is roughly the same. It's to find the vulnerabilities that you have and uncover those vulnerabilities. So a vulnerability scan is some automated software that searches systems for known security weaknesses. And it creates a report of those potential exposures. You should be conducting on existing systems, such as new technology when it's deployed. It's usually performed inside the security perimeter. In other words, we do it ourselves. We install it on a server. We run the scan. We do it periodically. And usually it's a rather passive process. It doesn't interfere with network operations, typically, a vulnerability scan. Although sometimes port scanners and things like that might cause some minor issues, but it's not common. So some of the methods that we use with vulnerability scanners, it could be an intrusive vulnerability scan, which attempts to actually penetrate a system in order to perform a simulated attack. Non-intrusive, which uses only available information to hypothesize what attacks might be possible. Credentialed vulnerability scan is a scanner that has the username and password of an active account so that it can basically simulate if the attacker had that information. But more important, it can reveal a lot more vulnerabilities if you have a credentialed vulnerability scan. And non-credentialed are more kind of real world if the attacker was just, if somebody out on the internet was trying to access a system, and by using all these tools, it's more approximate of what they might encounter. So here's some different types of scans and their description, or the difference really between intrusive and non-intrusive. And you can pause the video and take a look at this if you like, but this should also be, similar information should also be found in your textbook. Now let's talk about penetration testing. As I said before, you could take a whole class on pen testing. They're usually kind of fun pen testing classes, but it's designed to exploit a system's weaknesses, and it relies on tester skill, knowledge, and cunning. It's a lot different than doing a vulnerability scan, because with vulnerability scanners, you install some software, you click a button, and use some well-established techniques for it to give you a report on the vulnerabilities. For a pen test, that's merely the starting point. So the first step is to do something like a vulnerability scan, along with several other steps like getting some background information and reconnaissance and things like that. But pen testing doesn't stop there. Pen testing, the gloves come off, and you usually try any technique that you can think of to try to gain access. So the vulnerability scan might reveal that somebody is using Apache version whatever. So then if you're the person who's doing that pen test, you might look up the different vulnerabilities available in that version of Apache. You might find that there's some vulnerability that you can craft some special, HTTP header that might be able to circumvent the security and access private information or something like that. So definitely takes a little bit more skill and a lot more experience to do successful pen testing. And it's usually conducted by independent contractors. And typically from outside the security perimeter as opposed to inside. It gives you more of a real-world understanding of what your vulnerabilities look like to professionals on the outside. And the end result is a penetration test report. So hopefully they give you some kind of report that tells you how you did with your penetration testing. There are three basic techniques for penetration testing. There's a black box, white box, and gray box. Basically, a black box test is very real-world. It's where you hire somebody to do this test, and they know very little of anything about your internal network. You don't give them any information about, how your network works, what services and applications you're running. They don't know any of that. You're letting them try to figure that stuff out because, one of the ways that we try to protect our networks is to try to not reveal a lot of that information. So if they're able to find it, that's kind of telling of some issues we may have with our infrastructure security. A white box test is where you give the attacker the knowledge that they need. So you might tell them what version of Apache we're using, that we're using Microsoft SQL Server. And sometimes it's because we're specifically interested in them looking for vulnerabilities in that software. For example, Microsoft SQL Server is notoriously difficult to secure. So I might tell my pen tester that we're running Microsoft SQL Server so that they know that I'm looking for that information. I'm looking to see if I secured SQL Server the correct way. So that way they're not kind of glossing over the database. They're going to concentrate on that. And gray box testing is sort of a combination between the two, where we give them some limited information. For example, I tell them that we're using a database server, and that's kind of what I'm interested in them attacking. But maybe I don't tell them exactly what database server I'm using and what the IP address, or maybe what application uses it and what's stored in it. I don't tell them to look for credit card numbers, but maybe that's what I'm really looking to see if they can find. So that's black box, white box, and gray box testing. So this is just a table that shows you some of the features of both vulnerability and penetration testing. So for example, frequency is how often you're going to do a vulnerability versus penetration testing. And you can see that penetration testing is once per year, so not very common, whereas vulnerability scans are done constantly. And one of the reasons for that is if you look down at disruption about halfway down, vulnerability scans can be done passively and are typically done passively with very little disruption. But a penetration test is an active attack with a potential disruption. So a good way to think about this is fire drills. So fire drills is a great way to stay prepared in the event of an evacuation of a building. You can simply test to make sure that the fire systems are working, that they can detect smoke and heat and all that sort of thing, and that the sprinkler systems are working. You can put a couple guys on that, and I think they can do a pretty good job evaluating that. But to really prepare for a disaster, for a fire, you probably want to have a fire drill. The problem with a fire drill is everybody has to leave the building. You're sort of doing the whole test to make sure that everybody knows what to do and where to go and all that stuff. So that's a very high level of disruption. So most of us don't like to do fire drills more often than once a year. Most colleges I've taught at, maybe once a year they do a fire drill in each building, and that's about it. And if you're lucky, you're not in the building on any of the days that they're doing the fire drill, so you don't even know they're doing it. And in many cases, they'll tell you that they're doing a fire drill. In some cases, they don't tell you that they're doing the fire drill. Same thing with penetration testing. In some cases, people are aware this is happening, and in other cases, they're not. One of the major techniques that pen testers will use is social engineering. It's one of the easiest ways to get reconnaissance and information about networks. So in many cases, it's good to not tell people that they're doing this so that you can see how well they fare against those types of attacks, against the social engineering attacks. So very briefly, I also want to talk about third-party integration, which is kind of oddly in this unit, and I think probably the reason that this is, you could actually have a whole chapter about third-party integration. But basically, what's happening in IT, and has been happening for a very long time, is companies are very integrated now, where you have different companies that are interconnected to each other to do different things. So increasingly, organizations are partnering with each other to do different things. I work in healthcare, so in many cases, healthcare providers are partnering with billing companies. And the thing about partnering with billing companies is you have to start giving them all that data and giving them access to all that data so they can accurately bill and very quickly bill so you can get more money. So lots of good reasons to share a lot of information. But it's a lot of very sensitive information that's being shared. And the thing is, if one of my customers has their data compromised because of a partner's vulnerability, I'm still going to be blamed by the customer because I shared that information with them. I allowed that to happen. And I'm sure many of you are aware of the Target attack. Target, which is, if you're not aware, a large chain of stores, kind of like Walmart. They were attacked, and hundreds of, or millions really, credit card numbers were stolen. And the way the attackers were able to get into the Target. Now, so Target is pretty well known as having very good IT security. They do a pretty good job of maintaining IT security. So it was kind of surprising that Target was the target of this particular attack. But then we found out why. It was because the attackers were able to get access to Target through a third party. So they had a third-party company that they had partnered with that was doing, I believe it was a HVAC company that was doing HVAC monitoring of SCADA systems within Target stores. And it was through that network connection through which the attackers were able to gain access to Target. Target could have had the best IT security in the world, but since their third party had lackluster security, the attackers were able to get through that partner system to make it into the Target network. Gosh, it's really confusing to describe that because of the word target, but I think you get the idea. So basically, the risk of combining systems and data with outside entities, which is continuing to grow. So one thing that people will talk about is onboarding or starting up a relationship between partners. There should be some kind of a process to onboarding a new partnership. In many cases, when I'm involved in that process, we're doing an evaluation of each other's security. We're doing an evaluation of our VPNs and firewalls. We're making sure that we know, which users are going to be allowed to access resources on our side, and that they're setting up accounts for those people. And we have some kind of, there's some kind of a framework in place to manage all that stuff. And then eventually, offboarding. So if, taking that billing company as an example, if billing company A is providing the billing services for a medical provider, maybe that provider finds a better deal with another billing company. They switch billing companies all the time. So now they're going to have to offboard their old billing company. If they fail to do that, then the old billing company still has access to all those records. Now, maybe they're not going to do anything nefarious with those records. We don't think that they're going to steal any of that stuff or anything like that. It certainly wouldn't be in their best interest to do that. However, if an attacker gains access to their network for whatever reason, we now have another point of entry. So it's always best to have as few points of entry as possible. So you want to have both an onboarding and an offboarding process. So also application social networking sharing. How will different applications be shared between partners? Privacy and risk awareness. What happens if privacy policy of one of the partners is less restrictive than the other? So for example, where I work, we have very low restrictions on almost everything in our network because we're a very small company. But the larger companies with whom I work are very restrictive. So, sometimes those don't mesh very well, but it's important to understand that those things exist. And then who owns the data generated through the partnership and how is the data protected? So for example, a company that I work for might manage software for a larger company, and the question might become, if we no longer support that software, they decide to go to another vendor, how do they get their own data back? And a lot of that needs to be laid out through some kind of an agreement. And that's where we get into these interoperability agreements. And the most basic is the service level agreement, or the SLA. And this is a contract between the vendor and the client, so a contract between the partners, so you can lay out what the expectations are in the engagement in an SLA. There are other reasons we talk about SLAs in IT security, things like guaranteed uptime, or our expectation of uptime on various systems, networks, and so forth. So you'll hear this term in other contexts as well. And I think we talked about it in the previous course in IT Security 1. Then you have blanket purchase agreement, or a BPA, which is prearranged purchase or sale agreement between a government agency and a business. A memorandum of understanding, which describes an agreement between two or more parties. An interconnection security agreement, which is an agreement intended to minimize security risks for data transmitted across a network. And we usually see this where, if there's any sensitive data being sent and received between the two companies, I might ask in an ISA, I may demand or require that they're taking proper steps to protect that data. That way, if it ever becomes compromised, I have that to look to say, well, you did agree to protect that data, so now you're culpable for this loss, not me. So it's important to think about these things.